All right, well, it's a couple minutes after 6, so I will do my slow roll introduction. Hopefully we'll get some more people signing in. Hello, everyone. My name is Arif Khan. I'm the director of the UNM Art Museum. I'd like to thank you all for making the time to join us this afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are, for this conversation that is sponsored by and presented by our Student Advisory Board. Our Student Advisory Board is a relatively recent group at the UNM Art Museum, started maybe a year and a half before the pandemic. Pandemic, of course, as with everything else, threw that group and the museum into a little bit of disorder as we try to figure out how we can still be active when the museum was closed to the general public. So I want to thank, the Student Advisory Board members who have stuck with us through that time. And I also want to commend the Student Advisory Board members who have worked with us this academic year. We were able to first open in August, so I think we're all trying to figure out what our various roles are over the next year or two. So thank you to all of the Student Advisory members for sticking with us. They really help for me. I'm speaking for me personally, but I can also think for members of our staff. They help us inspire and are great feedback for the ideas we're presenting at the museum. So I really appreciate what they do. We started the Student Advisory Board to get student voices into the museum. And I think with that very basic starting point, they continue to fulfill that mission. So thank you. I'm going to hand it off to the president of the UNM Art Museum Student Advisory Board, Jeanette Martinez, who will introduce our speakers for today. I would like to thank Suhan and Hazel for making the time and working with us on this program. I'm very much looking forward to this. So everyone enjoy, and Jeanette, it's up to you.
All right, thank you, Arif, for the introduction. As Arif mentioned, I am the UNM Art Museum Student Advisory Board president this year. And as Arif mentioned, we're trying to kind of see what are the ways we want to navigate art, the museum, and also a big factor in this year's advisory board is to build better connections with the art community here in Albuquerque and within New Mexico. And so based off of that initiative that we want to do as a student advisory board, we really wanted the Fronteristxs collective to come and chat with us about what the organization or what the collective does as a art collective and its relationship here in the Albuquerque area. So I'll go ahead and give my description of the Fronteristxs in today's discussion, and then I'll hand it over to Fronteristxs. All right, so art interventions, community, and the museum will consist of a conversation with local art collective Fronteristxs. The Fronteristxs is a collective of artists based in New Mexico that work to end migration, detention, and the prison industrial complex through public art interventions. Through these interventions, they seek liberation for all. In this discussion panel, the Fronteristxs will talk with the University of New Mexico Art Museum Student Advisory Board, the SAB, about their perspective on art activism, community, and the role of the museums. The Fronteristxs will discuss with the SAB what they do in New Mexico as an art collective and also contribute their perspective on pressing questions that concern art and museums on a broader spectrum. Through this discussion panel, the SAB hopes to engage more with the art community in the Albuquerque area, as well as address critical questions about the role of museums and their responsibility to their respective communities. And with that, I will hand over the discussion to Fronteristxs. And then afterwards, we will have a Q&A. Feel free to add any questions you have into the chat box.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeanette. My name is Hazel. I use they, them pronouns. I am very excited to be here. I am one of the 4 members of the Fronteristas collective. And before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Tewa, Tiwa, and Pueblo peoples. And we recognize that this land acknowledgement is not enough, and it is only a starting point as a means to encourage folks to educate themselves, support Indigenous-led grassroots organizations, either by devoting time, money, or commitment to the movement to land back. And so with that said, I would love to kind of go into, we're gonna chat for about 20 minutes or so before we open it up to conversation. And I'd love to tell you all a little bit about our history in the collective and some of the projects that we've been doing. So Suhan, if you could skip to the next slide. And so yeah, like I said, we are the Fronteristas collective. I am one of the 4 members. Our other 4 members are Suhan Ho, who's here today, Martin Wanam, and Bernadine Hernandez, who both weren't able to join us. We started organizing around 2018. It was an artist exhibition that Suhan and Bernadine have put together in San Diego, and has then in 2020, the second iteration of the Fronteristas has since included both myself and Martin. Suhan, could you go to the next slide, please? And so we are a collective of artists in New Mexico that are working with community advocates to end migrant detention and to abolish the carceral state. We believe in fight for a world of liberation for all. And we do this through direct action, coalition building, and grassroots organizing. We believe there has never been a better time in recent history for the role of the artist in the freedom struggle. And as a collective, we work together to center the voices and artistic talents of those who are directly impacted by these issues as a way to create collective agency. Yeah, and so we bring our creativity and artistic skills to political action through banner drops, large-scale projections, artistic direct actions, performances, and also coalition building and political education. Here's a list of organizations and coalitions that we're currently working with: the People's Budget New Mexico, Prison Divest New Mexico, ABQ Anti-War Coalition, No Border Wall Coalition, and Free Them All New Mexico Coalition. Next slide. And so I'm just going to touch a little bit on some quick definitions of things that are really important in our work. One of those being what the prison industrial complex. So what is the prison industrial complex? It's a term used to describe the overlapping interest of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. The PIC is also inherently racist. It targets poor people, it's for profit, and it serves the state agenda. I'm pulling these definitions from Critical Resistance, just so you all know. Next slide. The next definition I'm going to touch on is abolition. So what is abolition? PIC abolition, and PIC stands for Prison Industrial Complex, is a practical organizing tool in a long-term goal. It is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. The PIC abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. And so now I'm just going to go ahead and give some quick facts about the PIC abolition, starting with kind of taking an outer look at this. So 1 out of 5 prisoners worldwide is incarcerated in the US. So if we think about that, that's a very large number of folks. Next slide. Looking more into the US has the highest rate of incarceration worldwide. So nearly 1 out of 100 people in the US is in a prison or a jail. And so now diving deeper into New Mexico, New Mexico incarcerates its people at a rate of 10% higher than the national rate. And then now going even deeper into New Mexico, here are some more facts. In particular, Albuquerque ranked second in rate of police killings among cities with a population of over 50,000. And New Mexico ranks #1 in the country for rate of police killings. Next slide. Okay, and so now I'm just going to talk really quickly about our projects that we've worked on so far. And first one being the Free Them All project. This campaign sort of first started when the COVID-19 pandemic began disproportionately impacting incarcerated people, and a national campaign began to mobilize under the Free Them All movement, calling for the release of people in prisons, jails, and detention centers in our state. And so, for example, October 24th of 2020, there were 1,628 COVID cases in New Mexico state and federal detention facilities. And that is a likely huge underestimate due to the testing availability at that time. So as a coalition, together with other coalitions in New Mexico, those that were working to end migrant detention and also to end the carceral state, we created these mobile banners with the intention of changing the configuration depending on the different places that we were protesting. And so we did these actions in New Mexico, the state capital, which is pictured here, but we also were at the Metropolitan Courthouse and the Bernalillo County Metropolitan Detention Center, so MDC. Could you go to the next slide? Another project that we worked on was on a campaign with Divest New Mexico, and that was to New Mexico faculty, employees, and staff, their pension funds were invested in private prisons. And so we partnered with the new Divest New Mexico to kind of take this down and see what we can do to disrupt it. We ended up working with the coalition to confront the New Mexico Educational Retirement Board to fully divest its funds from private prisons. And then this is just a quick little snapshot of that. It's a public large-scale projection that we did at the former county jail in downtown Albuquerque. And then next slide. Sorry, I know there's a lag too with this. So this is another really great project where we worked with community to make these large-scale banners that we then did at a banner drop here in Albuquerque off the highway. And this was just a really great experience of being able to work with community hands-on. You know, obviously this was during the time of the pandemic, so, you know, we're still keeping our social distance with masks, but it was a really great little workshop that we were able to conduct with community. Next slide. Yeah, and so this is I'm going to chat a little bit about our Free Them All billboards project, and which was first conceived as a response to all the injustices in jails, prisons, and detention centers, sort of continuing off with this earlier campaign that as an extension of this campaign that I was talking about earlier. And so we were really lucky to be able to have been funded by the Arts for Justice Fund, to then in turn be able to fund 7 local BIPOC artists in New Mexico to create these large-scale billboards that were aligning themselves both visually and with messages with Free Them All and Care Not Cages. And so throughout this project, it was super important for us to install these billboards close to locations where there was jails, prisons, and detention centers. A lot of community members didn't even know that such facility exists within our parameters. So the locations that we were kind of focused on were Albuquerque, Chaparral, Grants, Las Lunas, and Torrance. And so some of these billboards that Suhan is flipping through are just some of the 7 artists that we had worked with to get this messaging aligned. Unfortunately, with our last billboard that we're showing, Haley's billboard, the billboard company didn't want to print it because they had said that it was too political. So as a way for us to kind of skirt around this, we then were able to publish, their billboard in different locations. This one being here in El Chante, Casa de Cultura in downtown Albuquerque. And then in the next image is in Gallup Arts 123. This is another great billboard. This was done by S.A. Spook, who's an amazing artist currently incarcerated in Santa Fe. And it was great partnering and working with them. You can hear more about their process and what their experience was like working on this billboard, working with materials, trying to get this to us, et cetera. On our website, we have a little interview with them. Yeah, and so now I'm just going to talk really quickly about our Free Them All zines. The Free Them All zines is a 4-part political education series, and each zine features New Mexico-based artists and authors along with relevant facts, timelines, and information regarding each theme. And so we kind of sell these zines in community mercados to continue funding this political education series. And we also disseminate these zines kind of presented visually differently, but to our incarcerated communities in New Mexico. You're also welcome to download these zines and print them off of our website. And we also have them for sale at El Chante Casa de Cultura. And so our zine series consists of the first one, Impact of Policing. The second one is the Prison Industrial Complex. The third is Immigration, apologies. And then the fourth is Abolition. So definitely encourage you to check them out. A cute little snippet is that all the Fronteristxs members each wrote an introduction to the zine. So it's a nice little thing, but yeah. Okay, and so this is a project that we are all very excited about. The House of Anesthesia is an ongoing project that utilizes fashion as a tool to disrupt our collective numbness to the surveillance and policing that we experience in everyday spaces. So House of Anesthesia interrogates these intersections, right, of fashion, race, gender, sexuality, ability, policing, and capitalism in order to build life-affirming communities through an abolitionist framework. And so this particular photo, we are so full of gratitude to have been able to have been invited to this group show that was curated by Lucasa Bradford in San Francisco, California. And the show was called We Use Our Hands to Support. And this was really the first iteration of this project for us. Ideally, we really wanted to create this kind of like large scale performance, this experimental runway show. And in our next image, we were able to then do that, right? Like as part of this group show that Sherry Kreider put together. It's called Transveil, and it was at Off Lomas. And we were able to partner with these two beautiful, amazing drag queens, Avery and Novagina, to do this performance that really kind of embodied this second iteration of what we wanted it to be. So this experimental runway performance that had this reveal of their gloves, kind of exposing this language that was done with this typography of anti-surveillance, and then incorporated this drone, right? So I definitely encourage you all to take a look at that on our website. We also have it on our social media page, and we didn't include the full length of it because it's quite long, but definitely really exciting. And so now I'm just gonna chat very briefly about this last project, which is ongoing. We're in the midst of it right now. It's called CARE, and it stands for Collective Action and Resistance Education. And it's sort of a play off of the DARE program, which did a lot of like drug rehabilitation programs in schools in the 90s and 80s. And so we're doing this program, and we're working with a cohort of 20 students right now in middle and high school. And we've partnered with Working Classroom and Southwest Organizing Project. And we are working with these students twice a week for 10 weeks. In our first session with them a week, we talk about transformative justice, the punitive punishment system. We talk about harm. And then in the second session of the week, the students split up into two different tracks, art and writing, where they then are able to, utilize their personal stories and translate that into art or a writing piece. So this is a project we're really excited about, and these are just some images of folks that are in the program. So this is just a few of the students in the CARE program that are in the writing section. That's taught by Bernadine and Mario Montoya. And then in the next image, it's just the art section, which is taught by myself and my co-instructor, Josh Patterson. Yeah, and so that's just a little bit about the fun projects that the Fronteristxs are kind of working on right now and are excited about. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Suhan to, ground us a little bit more into this invitation that we've been brought into. So thank you.
Sorry, having trouble unmuting because I can't see my mouse. All right, thanks, Hazel. So I'm going to present a few slides on just the topic of conversation tonight. And as you can probably see, a lot of our work isn't necessarily gallery work or hasn't been deeply connected to museums. But, as artists, we're very interested in the discourse around museums and the role of museums. So we just kind of decided to frame this last part as, who are museums accountable to? And of course, we've seen over the last couple of years, the conversation and actions around public monuments and sculptures and what that means for the narrative around history. And I think museums are really implicated in all of that conversation. So we're hoping to leave plenty of time for the Q&A to have a lively discussion about this question. Who are museums accountable to? So just to provide a little bit of context, if you haven't been following, there has been a lot of kind of grassroots organizing around holding board members at elite institutions accountable. So the Whitney Museum Vice Chairman Warren Kanders is the owner of a defense manufacturing company called Safariland. And it was found that Safariland's tear gas canisters were used at the border when we were seeing all those images at the border under the Trump administration. We were seeing protests of the Sackler family, which is connected to the painkiller OxyContin, and how addictive and how much damage that company has caused in communities. The Sackler family has donated a lot of money to art museums, and the Met Museum was considering naming a wing after the family. And these protests led by artists and activists were specifically targeting that move and to try to block that move. There's a group called Strike MoMA that has been organizing around holding accountable the members of MoMA. And Leon Black specifically, has financial ties to Jeffrey Epstein. And there are over 150 artists that signed on to a letter to call for Leon Black's removal from the board. And then also more broadly speaking, like what, people are starting to look at all the members of MoMA board and looking at the ways that they uphold settler colonialism in Palestine. They uphold a lot of extractive industries in the US and globally. So then I want to talk a little bit also about the inequities in cultural institutions with regard to funding across the country. So just 2% of all cultural institutions receive nearly 60% of all contributed revenue, and that's an improvement. So only 2% of these institutions, a really small fraction, are receiving a lot of the funding. And you can see that in this graph. It shows, again, like institutions with a really high budget of over 5 million are getting the 58% share. And then institutions with less than 1 million, smaller institutions, which make up 90% of all groups, are getting 21% of the funding. And if we look at Arts Foundation funding to communities, rural institutions make up 20% of the US population, but they're getting 2% of the funding. Low income, you can see that 50% is the US population is made up of low income people, and they're getting 2% of the Arts Foundation funding, and people of color also really unequal, 37% of the US population, and they're getting 4%. This stat looks at the leadership of museums. A 2015 survey of US art museums commissioned by the Andrew Mellon Foundation revealed that only 16% of senior art museum leaders are people of color, just 5% of museum directors. And then this slide looks at foundations that give more than 10% of their funding to arts. So where is the money for arts funding coming from in terms of private foundations? Of these boards, of these foundations, more than 92% of the presidents are white, 87% of the board members are white, 85% of executive positions are held by white people, 68% of program staff are white. The number of people of color working in these foundations increased only 1% between 2011 and 2015. So we see a lot of inequity in arts and cultural funding. And then this statement from kind of is a nail on the head, and I'll just read this slide. We must think seriously about a collective exit from arts imbrication in toxic philanthropy and structures of oppression, so that we don't have to have the same conversations over and over, one board member at a time. Museums and other arts institutions must pursue alternative models, cooperative structures, land back initiatives, reparations, and additional ideas that constitute an abolitionist approach towards the arts and arts patronage, so that they align with the egalitarian principles that drew us to art in the first place. And I want to highlight a group called Cultural New Deal, and they have also pinpointed the racial and cultural inequality in arts organizations. And they have on their website, which you can go to at culturalnewdeal.org, specific calls to action, right? So the support, recognition, prioritization of the leadership of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the reversal of long-term inequities in funding, hiring, and resources in the arts and cultural sector, investment in arts and cultural ecosystems for Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, investment in building healthy communities through centering cultural and racial equity, accountability, commitment, and integrity in the pursuit of cultural and racial justice. Sorry about that. So yeah, you can go to the website and actually look at more detail for these specific demands. And then this slide was pulled from MUAC. It's a contemporary museum in Mexico City, and Hazel and I were talking about the prevalence of different kind of museum education in Mexico that could serve as a model. There's a lot of workshops, a lot of tutorials, a lot of educational programming in museums in Mexico. And we thought that was like a really cool model, and it's not necessarily tied to accreditation or like a specific certificate, but the museum serves as this hub for a lot of like arts education and contemporary art education. Another example is Tyler School of Art has a really interesting model for their curatorial, the decision-making in the museum. So they have brought a lot of community members, students, other stakeholders, not just staff and board members, to actually curate their shows. So that local communities have a say. And then this is just reiterating the resources out there. If you're interested in learning more, Strike MoMA, Cultural New Deal, there's an Instagram account called Change the Museum, Wage for Work, which talks about like economic equity for artists and like getting paid artist fees. And then art.coop. Also Decolonizing Museums, Representing Native America and National and Tribal Museums is a book that was written by Amy Lone Tree and really relevant to this conversation. So that's the last slide, and really happy to like open it up. I know that was a lot of information, and people process at different rates. So feel free to just drop questions in the Q&A. If there's something that you wanted us to pull back up, we are happy to do that. And we also wanted to talk specifically about the role of university art museums, because it's a little bit different structure than the museums that we referenced here. You know, UNM, AM, for example, probably doesn't have a board that it answers to. It answers to the educational hierarchies within UNM, which ultimately does have a board. But the role of that board and then the programming and function or like community that's served in a university museum is slightly different too. So would welcome any conversation and questions about that.
All right, thank you so much, Hazel and Suhan. That was a really informative discussion about Fronteristas, as well as engaging with the topic that we have at hand. I appreciated the kind of timeline, let's say, of all the projects that y'all have been doing. Because I feel like I've known about Fronteristas for a while now, but I really didn't even know that you were doing that much, which I think really made me think a lot about that role of community that I've been thinking about, and like, how do you do it? Like, how do you integrate the community that you're in with these, with your art practice, and as well as like going back to your mentioning of museum education, like how does that kind of turn into one of the more important factors in rethinking how museums navigate the space they're in, and as well as the community like feeling welcomed within the museum itself. So anyone is welcome to throw in some questions in the Q&A. I will just kind of start to get the ball rolling, but please, if you have a question, do not be shy, please ask. I did have a question about, and you kind of talked about this with the example about the one of the last slides about the, I think it was the museum in Mexico City, related to museum education models. But prior to showing that, I kind of had a question about like, what do alternative models look like in terms of museum education and art museum, whether it be related to like the physical space, like is it just something that's kind of without that kind of building structure and existing somewhere else, or is it something that's more internal? So yeah, if we want to just kind of chat about that. All right, we also have 2 questions so far. Let's see, and can you see these, Suhan and Hazel? Okay, so I'll go ahead and just read it aloud, and then if you want to talk about the question, we can do that. So the first question is from Israel. How can we encourage more poor people of color to join in art education at museum as a hub?
Suhan, should I start?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I guess immediately what comes to mind is accessibility, right? Thinking about the literal layout of the city and like where the university museum or museum might be located, right? And what are like the public routes that for someone who's taking public transportation, for someone who's walking, to be able to access those spaces, right? So I think of accessibility in that kind of way, also in thinking about being able to make sure that also museums are like ADA adequate, and for folks who do have disabilities can access those spaces as well. Another thing that I think comes to mind is when we think about, how can we encourage more poor people of color to join in art education in the museum as a hub, and maybe as a way to sort of counter what I've said about accessible, about location wise, is an alternative tactic perhaps could be, right, bringing a workshop to the community itself, right? Bringing the resources to community instead of asking community to meet you there, but meeting them halfway, right, somewhere. And I don't know, Suhan, did you want to add anything? I feel like there's so much more, but being on the spot, I'm sweating.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think being out in the community in visible ways and making sure that that folks that don't live nearby or folks that aren't in these usual circles know about what's going on. So how are we publishing, how are we doing publicity in like multiple languages, in multiple geographic spaces? If transportation is a problem, like maybe transportation from schools or from community centers, or like bringing exhibitions out into the community, like Hazel said. And I think like that was a big impetus for our CARE program too. We were partnering with Working Classroom and SWAP, who have like such a long storied history of working with people of color communities and working around economic inequality and prison industrial complex and all kinds of justice issues. So like that was really important for us to not be a program that was run through campus, but out in community. And specifically, we host the classes at Working Classroom, which is in Barelas.
All right, sorry, I couldn't unmute either. Thank you for those comments on that question. I just want to throw in a little comment on CARE too. I think this question is really important as well, because it's also, I think, a question I've had as a person of color that ended up being in the arts, and how I ended up doing what I do is through a program that was very similar to CARE. And where I went to high school, which was a Title I predominantly student of color, low income high school, and we didn't have any access to arts. And so just by those initiatives, those kind of community initiatives that really like altered my whole trajectory on life. So hopefully these conversations are impactful to others as well. I have more to say, but let's get to the next questions. Okay, so Alejandra's question is, do you have advice for academics getting involved in grassroots programs and focusing in the scholarly world? How do you balance those two different spheres of activism?
I can jump in here. So I'm just going to try to make sure I understand the question. advice for academics in getting involved in grassroots program and focusing in the scholarly world, like doing both at the same time. How do you balance those two different spheres? Yeah, that's like a really good question, because there are such different measures and metrics in those two different worlds, right? So in grassroots programs, I think like as someone with privilege coming in, you know, economic privilege, like status, I think it's really important to just be humble and listen to the work that's already been done, the leadership that's already there, not try to force your own agenda or insert yourself in a way that's like not welcome. Focusing in the scholarly world, that's really tricky too, because scholarly world has its ways that it measures success and like the boxes you have to check, and you know what counts as a line on your CV. So I don't know. I think for me personally as an artist, I'm lucky in that the work that I do with Fronteristxs is recognized in my position at the university. But I know that's not the case for everybody in different fields that aren't art-based. Yeah, Hazel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I might differ just a little slightly in my response to this, in that as an educator and as an organizer, I don't really see myself separating those two identities. You know, when I'm in the classroom, when I'm organizing, I try to carry myself in the same kind of way with the same kind of values and intentions. And while I know that there's different measurements of success that do incur with being an academic, and there's certain hoops that we do need to jump, but that does not mean that we have to conform and we need to become this robot of academia. I think there's value in holding that, right? Like, I've been handed a syllabus before and have been taught to teach that syllabus, but I've also deviated from that syllabus and have been like incorporating my own values into this, my own ways of connecting with students that are influenced a lot from my organizing identity. And I think I see this kind of happening a lot in the CARE program too, right? Having previously taught in an institution and then moving into a space, right, where it's not so institution affiliated, so you don't have those sorts of pressures of just having, to have certain conversations with students. It's really taught me to break down hierarchy in the classroom a lot, you know, thinking a lot more critically, even of just like me standing up in the class, in the front of the class, versus like sitting with students and being at their level. That might have been a little bit of a tangent. But also, you know, I think when entering any sort of community space, your role should always be to listen. You know, I think as academics, we go into certain spaces with our own agenda, with our own sort of intention of, we have a project we need to get done, or we're working with community and we expect a certain result. But from my own experience, I feel like the best thing to do is to just listen and understand that it takes time, right? For collaborations to form, for trust to be built. And I think the most important thing though is showing up. So even more than just listening, when you show up in a space 4 or 5 weeks in a row, that says a lot, right? In addition to just listening. So.
Thank you. Thank you for those responses. Hopefully that was a helpful response for Alejandra and everyone else listening. All right, the third question is, how do you choose your projects? RFPs driven by artists, your social media, or current political conversations?
I'd love to know what RFPs are.
I don't know.
I think it's requests for proposals, like, so
Okay.
like, are we gearing our projects to what's out there for funding?
Oops, sorry, I raised my hand by accident.
Do you want to take this first, Hazel?
Sure, yeah. I think since we're a collective of artists, we all bring our own experiences as directly impacted individuals to our work, also to our own artwork that we make outside of the collective. And I think that that for us, that kind of becomes a guiding point, right? We all have our interests, they all kind of overlap in some ways. And I think that we take an approach to collaboration and picking projects in this, I want to say, in a very like organic kind of way. There's sometimes, we'll be invited to do a project. Other times, we're conceptualizing that project from like start to finish, and thinking about all the components that are involved with that. Something that I think we value a lot within our own collective is just making sure that, not only are we each showing up to do the work, but also, how is it that we can continue to honor ourselves and honor the work that we're doing, and trying to also further our own careers and working with community, right? So I wouldn't say that our projects are just chosen in like career-driven way, more so in just trying to figure out like what works best for all of us, and like how is it that we can also work with community and work with other artists. We're always trying to uplift the work of other artists within our projects. There's always a lot of collaboration that's happening even within just us four, and collaboration, beyond just our circle. So yeah, Suhan, do you want to add some stuff?
Yeah, I think that you hit it, most of the points that I would say. Like, some of the projects come with like a really specific invitation, and then we're brainstorming together, or some of them are like emerging out of our conversations. Like, we really want to do some political education, so we came up with the zines, and we were inspired by the Black Panther newsletter. And so I think like project to project really differs. Sometimes it's coming out of a collaboration with another organization or another group of artists. And sometimes, like, there has been times, I think, where we looked for funding. We thought, how can our interests like align with this grant opportunity? But I think for the most part, we're really clear on our values. And so, funding is always a question for artists and organizations that do what we do. So it's not like it doesn't exist, that, that we do look for opportunities that align with like work on the prison industrial complex or work in mass incarceration.
Thank you for those responses. Oh, great. I think there's another. Okay, so have you been approached by museums or traditional arts organizations to share your work and or collaborate, present a project?
Yeah, do you want to take it away, Sue?
Sure, I can take it away. I think the one that comes to mind is the Southern Exposure Gallery opportunity in San Francisco. I mean, they're a nonprofit gallery, not a museum per se, but they did specifically invite us, and also have been interested in further collaborations. Am I missing any others, Hazel?
I don't think so. We do have some like exciting projects kind of like stirring in the pot right now that I don't think we can talk about yet, but some exciting stuff happening that, yeah. I mean, and going back to it, you know, I don't think, sort of as an extension to answering this question, you know, I don't think that we would be opposed to working with a museum, right? If that opportunity arises itself. But I think for us, we are going back to this question. I think Suhan, you had started your portion of the presentation with who are museums accountable to. You know, for myself, I think we've kind of made it a point to almost go through this sort of like a vetting process whenever we partner with an organization or with anyone who's interested in showing our work. And in that vetting process, we sort of reflect and ask, we first look into the organization itself or museum itself. We look at how it is that they're supporting their community. You know, how are they showing up? What are they doing directly? We look at leadership. And we also look at, I mean, I'd say we're not entirely super focused on this, but I think within the work that we do, it's important that, you know, there is some sort of compensation involved. You know, artists should be paid. And while that's not our entire focus, that is something we take into consideration, right? How are you valuing our time and our energy? So yeah, I think that if for us, that's sort of like our, and I'm sure maybe I'm missing something else in that vetting process, but it's how we approach working with organizations, you know, that are institutions or coalitions.
Thank you for that response. I really like that you said all of that, because I think it's, I don't think that's what a lot of people kind of envision when they think about like the process of getting into a museum, you know, or like showing their work. Like, I think a lot of times it's almost like this kind of level or like clout thing, like, oh, your work's going to show at a museum. But Fronteristas are almost doing kind of like the opposite, in that like you're very intentional about choosing like where your work can be placed, so that it reflects, you know, your message. So thank you for that response. I think there was, let's see. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. Does anyone have any lingering questions? If not, I think we'll just end with this last kind of question that Suhan kind of brought up in the beginning. I have it worded a little differently, but it's basically the same thing in terms of what we're saying. And we've kind of already talked about it, but what is the role of the museum in its community? So I think a lot of times it's kind of these two, the community and museum, are kind of put together, but I don't think the conversation is always had, or it's not had enough about what that actually looks like. So are there any kind of final thoughts about that in particular?
I'll say that one thing that I remember was a shift once RF came on board, which I thought was really important, was to leave essentially like a project space available, so that not everything was programmed out for years. So there was like room for spontaneity, room for like things that come up. And I think that's really important and really valuable.
Definitely, I agree. Anything from you, Hazel? No pressure, but I just in case you have anything else to say about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I am, it does get a lot, you know, going through my head and thinking about this. You know, I think a good, you know, we talked a little bit about accountability, transparency, showing up. And yeah, and I think when it comes to working with community, like I wish the question could be like I don't know, I feel like the question just so much poses it as like museum as this like education institution, like feeding this community, when as opposed to I feel like it should be community feeding museum, and I'd love to see, I don't know, I'm really inspired by the Tyler School of Art and their own curatorial process of involving community. I'd love to see more access to collections, right? And I also would love to see some more local artists, in museums. I don't feel like that's ever enough. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great response. I like your comment on like community feeding museums instead of like the other way around, because I think that almost like addresses the question even better, right? Like just even changing the kind of like hierarchy or level that you're putting the museum in context with the community. Thank you. All right. Any final questions, comments, anything? Yes, what can museums learn from the community?
Yeah.
Lots. Let's see. All right. Well, I think this is our closing, but we'll leave off with that question for everyone to think about. Thank you so much for the Fronteristas, Suhan and Hazel, for joining us today in this conversation. It was really helpful and an engaging talk, especially having just, I wanted to have a different perspective on museums, not necessarily like museums talking about museums, but a collective that isn't necessarily always directly in the museum space, and what is their opinion on it. So thank you so much for being here. And with that said, if there's any final questions, yes. I think this will be this is being recorded, so you'll have access to it afterwards. And thank you so much.
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette and Devin.
Thank you.